So I haven't done a video in a while, and this topic has been pressing on my mind for quite some time. So I thought that I'd finally get off my arse and make a video for you guys. This video is going to be a bit blackpilling, but I hope that it brings to the attention of people in England, people across Europe, and people in the States as to what kind of situation we're living in the north of England. When we look at large metropolitan areas in England, mainly I'm talking about London, Manchester, and Birmingham, the culture changed slower than it has been doing in smaller towns, and of course that seems logical. The population is much larger, and therefore it takes much more of a move of population into that area to change the culture radically. However, in my instance, that's not going to be the case. We're in the north of England, where I'm situated and where all of my family lives. Most of the communities tend to be... There are big cities. There's Manchester, there's Liverpool, there's Leeds, there's Sheffield, there's York, there's Lincoln. These are some major centres. And all of these places have seen a serious demographic shift, just as with London. On a personal note, I have visited Leeds a lot in the last few years. I studied there, and I found that it was very surprising to me living in Leeds and being an ethnic minority. Of course, it seems weird that I would say that if you know my past. I lived in China for a long time. But the simple difference there is that you expect to be a minority when you move overseas. When you go to a place like China, you know that everyone there is ethnically homogenous and identify a certain way, and you're going to be an outsider to them, no matter the colour of your skin. The most stark change I've noticed over the last 5 years that I was in China is that whites are becoming a minority in all of their major centres in the UK, whether that be in Manchester, whether that be in Birmingham, whether that be in London. But most surprising to me on that point is that this is not a city problem. This isn't just remaining a degenerate urban problem that the metropolitans suffer while the rural people don't. I live in a small town in the north of England, very small, maybe a few thousand people, and we have also seen the effects of mass migration on this community. There are several times and in several places in this tiny town where I have been a minority. In the leisure centre, in the high street, just the shop owners and the business owners in this area, visiting certain places, going to certain parts of the town, or indulging in certain activities, you notice that you're the only white English person there. And even then, in some circumstances, I found that while there might be more whites there, these whites are not Anglo-Saxon. They're from the continent, they're from Eastern Europe, they're from other communities. And it's surprising. Perhaps it's more surprising because during my youth, I lived in a very small town that was in the north of England, and we were away from any major metropolitan area. Our closest one wasn't a very middle-class city. It wasn't the kind of Manchester or Birmingham where it was a huge centre of industry and work. The city that I lived near was more of a middle-class farmers' market, a historical city, and it was the capital of the county and has been for over 1,000 years. So really its status of a city was mainly due to its historical precedent and not much in terms of its manufacturing or urban capabilities. And even in that city, there wasn't a big attraction for minorities and overseas workers when they came, because of it being so gentrified and because the opportunity for jobs was even difficult for the white working classes. Of course they didn't move into these areas. The housing would be too expensive, the food would be too expensive, etc., etc. And equally, in the town that I lived, there wasn't much attraction for seriously large ethnic minority communities, mostly because the town offered nothing in the way of serious work commitment. It was centred around one industry, which I won't make too obvious because I don't want to dox myself, but this one industry grew the town, and the town itself either provides services for the people who worked in that industry or worked in that industry directly. Interestingly, during my youth, there was a small community of Pakistanis that lived in a certain area of the town, and it really was a ghetto. It really was that they were confined to this area and didn't spread out much. And even then, some way into my youth, my mother made the decision to get out of that town and move into a much smaller one that was in a more rural area. Surprisingly though, even in that small town, we're already beginning to see the effects of mass migration. Already there's a Turkish barber on the highway. Already some of the service people have changed in their identity and race. And it's unusual because I don't think the British, the indigenous English at least, realise how much they're being outnumbered. And I think that comes down to the fact that there's not much of a community anymore. Whereas when minorities move into an area, they tend to try and build a cohesive community. The white English around me in my community, in the city that's closest to me, and this area, don't tend to congregate in large communities. They don't come together in a community spirit. They don't act in a community. They act as atomized individuals. When they do come together, it's at the pub. And even then, it's not like a large discussion between more than one or two friendship groups. In contrast to that, recently, there's been a very large community of Hong Kong families that have moved into this area, this small town in the north of England, have moved into this area, and it's around 150 different families that have come into the larger area that I live in. 150 families. That kind of level of people could overtake a town in a generation, and this is what's happening to small, developed, working-class communities all over the north, in Lincolnshire, in Yorkshire, and in Lancashire, and possibly in Northumbria as well, although I'm not as wise to them. The problem here remains that the working class communities in the north have a lower standard of living, and therefore their resources, their food, their water, their electricity tends to be cheaper because it needs to fit around the fact that they tend to have a lower wage than their compatriots in the south. This means that because of the cheaper standard of living, the natural attraction for immigrants is to these areas where the majority of the workforce are unskilled, and they can be easily replaced by somebody who's more committed to the job and has fewer aspirations. And as atomized as Northern English people tend to be, the migrant communities around them are very community-based. They communicate to each other, they organise, they get together at their homes and in community places. A recent story for me is that even today I went to the leisure centre to do my usual gym workout, and the badminton court was completely overtaken. 6 courts completely overtaken by Muslim immigrants who were 2 to 3 families, each of which was 8 members. And they were organised, coming together and playing together. You rarely see situations like this with white communities. They're completely atomised. They don't communicate with each other. They barely know their neighbours. They barely know the people who are a few streets over. The problem is now that while the boiling frog is a total cliche, it really is the situation for working class northern towns in England. By and large, they're being replaced, and at a rate where, if they don't realise it soon, they'll quickly find themselves outranked And the usual belief in England has been over the last, 20 to 30 years, that you can vote yourself out of this problem. And I don't think that the white English in the north are going to realise that before they've reached the end. I hope this has been informative. Thanks for listening. See you on the next one. 再见.